Hey, everybody, are you confused about tariffs? Join the club. You're watching Tech Strong Gang. We'll be back in a minute. Hey, folks, welcome to the Tech Strong Gang for today. I'm Mike Vizard, your host. Joining me today is Dan O'Brien, who's president and COO of the Futurum Group, and Chris Blask, and also new member, Kate Scarcella. She's been on the show a couple of times now, but if you haven't caught a couple of episodes, Kate is a security expert and does a lot of work in app dev. So, plays both sides of the ball, as they say. Folks, welcome to the show. We're going to have a little chat up early here now about what's going on with all these tariffs, because if you're like me, I'm having a hard time, frankly, keeping score. Lately, we've now seen that there's going to be tariffs maybe going into South Korea and Japan, but then we're waiting to see what happens with Europe, and it looks like the tariffs themselves were delayed. Dan, a lot of folks in IT right now are trying to figure out their budgets for the coming year. And it's July, and a lot of them are ending their fourth quarter coming up at, I think it would be September-ish. It's very hard to plan in this environment, but what's your take on what's going on here, and what should IT folks be thinking about?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Not sure we'll figure it out here today, but hopefully we can shed a little bit of light on kind of what's going on. Listen, I think the big theme is, negotiations will continue until tariffs improve, right? That's kind of, the path we're headed down still. Deals in place with Vietnam and the UK, bit of a partial deal with China, and really still trying to work it out with the rest of the world. Kind of under the microscope more recently, seems to be Japan and South Korea, and obviously, of major concern to the tech industry, given the prominence of firms like Samsung in South Korea and Sony and Tokyo Electron and many others in Japan. Disruption and, uncertainty in the supply chain, not a good thing for anybody. Really hard for business planning, really hard in terms of understanding, where pricing may come in. And so, I think we're all still trying to figure out where this goes. It feels like we've kind of had this July 9th date out there for a while. That's tomorrow for those checking the calendar. Seems like we're going to push that to August 1st in a lot of cases. So a lot of tough rhetoric out there, not a lot of progress. And, really, I think a lot still up in the air. But, South Korea and Japan most recently under the gun, and, also a little bit of ire towards the BRICS countries, right? And, kind of the extended tail that's associated with them, as they added a lot of countries last year. The targets keep shifting, but not a lot of progress being made. Negotiations continue.
It seems to me, too, with BRICS, and you brought that up, but the C in BRICS stands for China, and I thought we had a partial deal, and yet now we're threatening anybody who kind of is associated with BRICS, and it's just a little more confusing than ever.
Well said. Yeah. Maybe that's the partial part of the partial deal. But it's an interesting collection of countries for sure. Obviously, you've got Iran in there with, the countries that were added more recently, South Africa, Ethiopia, many others. Definitely a bit of a tough group to negotiate with for the United States at this point in time.
Chris, here's my question to you, and you've worked in cybersecurity for years, but do I pay attention to any of this stuff, or do I just ignore it and plan and kind of this is just some sort of black swan event that may or may not happen, but I kind of just can't plan for it, so I must ignore it?
Well, you can plan for anything, right? And as you know, here, I've discussed enough of this, over the years, but I've worked all over the world, and you can plan this in Yemen. You can plan this in Colombia, which is much more stable, but it's not, traditionally as stable as a first world country. And you just have to understand the dynamics, and this, the narrative is the hero's return, the Odysseus story, right? We're coming back, and, the homeland has been overrun. So every day and every week and every month, there has to be a story of rooting out the traitors. And this, it sounds a little silly on a global economic or national economic level, but this is an example of it, right? There's 90 deals in 90 days, or no deals in 100 days, or 2 deals in 3 days. It doesn't matter. If it's inside the narrative of the hero's return, then every morning when we wake up, there's a hero story coming to root out the whatever. So, and again, you can plan for security and operations in war-torn countries. And the U.S., fortunately is not that at this point, but narratively it kind of is. You're planning operations and budgeting. Assume that there may be some hero return story next spring where tariffs go up 700% on the left-handed countries that were mean to us last week.
I love your analogy because part of my soul says that this is, a fictional story here designed to create those heroes. And if I look at the math around what the existing deals are, they haven't really moved the needle on the tariffs one way or the other very much. So, Kate, should I just assume that the tariffs are going to be relatively stable, give or take a couple of percentage points, and proceed along?
We really don't have a choice, right? Other than to proceed, because if we just stop, what happens then, right? So we have to move forward with the littlest that we can move forward with. We don't have a choice, in other words. It's concerning, right? In that sometimes I wonder, are we going to negotiate ourselves out of everything and we're going to be left alone, just standing and being like, because nobody's going to want to play with us? I mean, I wouldn't want to play with us. Like if every day I woke up to a different strategy, how is that a strategy? And that's what I feel like is we're expecting globally, like literally there's like a new strategy every day. And how do we, as a company, I couldn't imagine trying to make a strategy with a new strategy every day. Like that in itself doesn't even make sense. So how do we get partners and solidify deals in what tomorrow may be a country that is going to get hit with a very high tariff? I being in cybersecurity, I don't know why I didn't like the term resilience. But gosh, do we not need resilience right now? Do we not need to have this type of strategy where, okay, maybe I can't do a deal with this country and I have to shift really quick, and maybe have multiple areas where we can take from, but that's hard to manage, right? So
this is there's a news show in the tech world and so forth, and I think a lot of people have opinions on this, and I certainly have mine. I'll be happy to talk about them here. However, right, it's, as a security person, I'm always coming into environments and saying, all right, I know you stated what you want. I need to tell you what the reality is. Here's what is on the table for you as an organization, as a company, as a person, whatever it is. And I find, look, I'm an American citizen, born and raised. I live in Canada. My family's Canadian. I've traveled the whole world. And it pains me to say this, but this is the U.S. U.S. right now, Maya Angelou said, when someone tells you who they are, believe it. Right? The administration right now includes people like Stephen Miller, who has stated he'd like to see a U.S. population of 100 million. And we have an administration that very specifically wants to have zero trade deficit with everything. And that's not a global trade system. So it's an isolationist world, isolationist country, where you can't really realistically do long-term business as an American company with international companies, because the conditions absolutely will change. And they probably won't change in a positive way. So if you put yourself in that world and try to plan around that, it may not come out with a lot of good results, but it's the world you need to be in, I think.
Well, as Mike said, though, the deals we're seeing really haven't changed that much from the prior reality. And I think that, the market has certainly written off kind of the anchoring strategy to these negotiations, right? We've kind of set the bar so far to the extreme that kind of nobody believes that's actually going to hold for the long term, right? That's largely how kind of the world's behaving. I also wonder, how much of what we're seeing is kind of the full story of what's going on, right? I mean, we're talking about tariffs, but it feels like there is a broader kind of resetting of the global order and the relationships we have across a lot of different vectors beyond tariffs that's kind of happening here as well. So I don't know. I take a step back from kind of the daily news flow and the confusion we're all kind of wrestling with in terms of the daily narrative. And I kind of say I think we've anchored really hard. I think the market's discounted that, the reality of what we've actually seen come through is actually pretty pragmatic and not all that different than prior. But also, it feels like there's something bigger at play beyond just tariffs here.
Dan, I think also IT leaders need to get in front of this a little bit, because there's a history that says, the amount of money allocated to IT is usually a percentage of sales. But if you keep thinking in those terms, you won't realize that how dependent upon the business is now on IT. And so maybe the budget for IT is actually larger, especially when you count in all the folks who are spending money in given departments. But is it time to have a more realistic conversation about just how strategic IT is to businesses?
I think it is, Mike. I mean, technology is the source of competitive advantage in, almost every industry now. So, I do think a slowly increasing, kind of IT budget as a percentage of sales, particularly as we enter the AI era here, that's probably the reality for the companies that win in the long term. You can resist it in the short term. I'm not sure that's going to lead to more competitive advantage in the long term, though.
And I do agree. And Chris, I do like, talking about level setting expectations. And then that is right, something that has to be done. And I think, to Dan's point, definitely AI could, as much as, we fight against this, but we definitely have to incorporate that into our strategy.
Yeah, I mean, listen, all the levers change, right? If IT goes up, well, R&D as a percentage of sales may go down because we're getting greater developer efficiency with coding tools, right? G&A sales may go down as we're automating a lot of the back office, right? So, I think everybody's afraid of taking IT up too far, but if you've got the offsets in other parts of the organization, I mean, I think cloud did this really well, right? Cloud made everybody kind of understand the financial model of we're going to shift CapEx to OpEx. I think with AI, you're really talking about shifting, G&A and R&D potentially, more into the operational tech spend. And that may be a fine reality, but, without the offset, I think it's a tough conversation for people to stomach.
Well, I just want to loop back with a more positive note because I think I laid a lot of gloom there. However, you'll find out if you're a first world country person, you go to a third world country, that business actually doesn't stop, right? I think what American companies need to get in is their minds is the buffer a lot of variability. I think you two are right. The tariffs are a lot of noise. Whatever they are now is probably about the same. But don't be surprised if they suddenly spike up 7,000% in your area. But you survive a lot of crazy things as businesses, right? Just don't fool yourself.
Another way to look at this, to Dan's point, there are top lines and bottom lines. And if the top line is going to suffer, there's going to be a lot more focus on making the bottom line better. And that's where IT folks can shine. So I'm just saying, maybe now's a good time to get in front of the whole thing, right? All right, folks, we'll be back in a minute to talk about our next topic.
Discover TechStrong Group, the epicenter of tech innovation. We're your go-to for reaching IT leaders and practitioners worldwide. Our secret? Impactful content that sparks awareness, engagement, and top-quality leads. With us, you'll access editorial websites, streaming videos, virtual events, custom content, analyst research, and more. Join our satisfied clients. Let's revolutionize your tech journey. Contact us today and tell your story to the world in the most powerful way with TechStrong Group.
Hey, folks, we're back, and yet there's been another merger in IT. It seems like there's one every other day these days, but this latest one seems to really speak to the heart of what's going on with AI and data centers. CoreWeave is buying an outfit called Core Scientific for $9 billion in stock, and that seems like chump change these days in the land of AI. But Kate, you've been dealing with this for a long time, and you've seen these mergers and acquisitions. Are we at some level of scale now that seems a little bit on the mind-boggling side?
Definitely. I think overall, if we look at what is happening from one perspective, it's the idea that you're looking at core infrastructure, right? This acquisition will be, will help, I think, overall on operational control and, will be very important going forward. Reducing the dependency on third-party co-location, improving financing, flexibility, all that all becomes really important. And we saw it, right? Then you started doing this with cloud, now with this. Yes.
Dan, you've been an analyst for a long time. What's your take on this deal? And are we in some sort of level of frenzy for M&A, or what's your feel here?
So I think this deal makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, CoreWeave has really, grown the way they have by making GPUs really accessible and really easy to use for developers, right? Like the software layer they've put on top of the kind of core GPU access that they provide, through their NVIDIA partnership. That's really where they've kind of differentiated and really become kind of the neo cloud of choice in the market. Core Scientific brings kind of the raw data center infrastructure piece, right? The power, kind of the site, site facility management, all of that. I think this is just a classic vertical integration play. Makes a ton of sense to me in terms of the synergy of the two businesses. I also think you gotta love the deal, right? This is a $9 billion all stock deal that gets them out of $10 billion in future kind of commitments and obligations on data center leasing fees, and they also inherit $1.6 billion in assets. So for nothing, they've reduced their future liabilities on cash materially, added I think a really synergistic partner in the business, and picked up a bunch of assets which will carry some pretty solid balance sheet benefits to them. So I think there's a lot to like this deal. This one's been long rumored, at least for a few weeks. This one's been kicking around. So where there was smoke, there was fire on this one. But I think it makes a lot of sense.
I think, Chris, we've talked on this show many times about the fact that we're building out more data center capacity and AI is driving that. But the flip side of that conversation is we don't have enough capacity right now, which is kind of putting everything in a premium. So are we going to see this wave of consolidation? Because the math would suggest that supply and demand is going to create an imbalance in the force, as they say.
Well, let me speak to the supply part. I guess the demand as well. But I've got a lot of opinions about how we're doing and what we call AI right now, and I think it's wonderful, it's fantastic, it's transformative, and we're doing it. Let me just to keep it simple, all wrong, all of it, right? And the fact that we're on a DHS call yesterday, interesting conversation about this, and one of the points I was trying to make there is we're trying to take these complex semantic engines and get them to do math, right? To be clear, AI doesn't have any idea what 42 is. It's the integer above 41 and below 43, but it doesn't have there's no binary, there's no hexadecimal. We're walking over to someone and saying, hey, could you open up a file and find the seventh field and tell me whether or not the value is 42? For a piece of code, basic, literally basic Fortran code, whatever, would do that with 0.00001% of the effort. And we're doing that because it just works. But it's such an incredibly brute force approach that we literally have national global grid issues and energy supply issues because we're just trying in the last 36 months. This is not, long-term planning. This is a phenomenon that has rushed forward, and we want these monolithic individual models, each of them using enough power to run a small town for a year, to make us a picture of a cat. And how enthusiastic I am about the technology, but I think the next step is, for all of I have biases in this, obviously, but distributed civic AI sort of approaches rather than isolated monolithic massive models. So I agree with you, Dan. I think logistically and corporate and financially it makes sense. It is yet another nationalist isolationist approach, which I don't think is wonderful. But more than that, it's an example of the build a battleship and sail it up a creek type of approach that we have with AI.
I love your examples, Chris. I mean, they're right on. While we see this problem and how we attack the problem is very interesting. So we went and this was definitely a major issue. And how do we do this, basically this consolidation? And I love the analogy. It's exactly what's happening. We build the battleship, and
Yeah, we've just started just in recent days started now analyzing this because for our as a company we're taking a different approach, and I'm willing to find out that we're wrong in this one, but I generally think that we can reduce electricity usage and get better benefits out of what we're calling AI. Reduce power usage by 90 to 99%.
Totally agree, Chris. I mean, ultimately, a different architecture is needed, right?
So to that point, how hard will it be to make that shift? Because historically, Kate, let's start with you on this. You do software, but we start out with let's just build something and hope it works, and then we consume all the resources, and then we spend a lot of time figuring out how to optimize it for the next several years. And I feel that's kind of where we are with AI, and maybe the hardware folks are overestimating how much data center capacity we're going to need.
Absolutely. We are, building the plane while it's flying, right? That analogy that we've used forever. And I agree that that's what's, happening here as well. I think once we get, I don't feel that we strategize well, and we are still we are so reactive. It is concerning how reactive we are. I think if we were just to sit back for a moment and to really think about how we want to move forward, but we rush to build everything. And then I think we're going to have a bunch of these, huge data centers that aren't in use, quite frankly. I think if anything, AI will actually, if, again, what do we call AI, and what are, machine learning and everything. But I really think that there's so much potential there that it could actually minimize this footprint that we're building furiously.
See, I'm more bullish there. I mean, I come back to the DeepSeek moment and that phrase Jevons paradox that we all came to know through that, which was basically, as the cost of AI comes down, we're going to have more AI. I mean, think about all the use cases for AI where the cost of training, the cost of inference today just doesn't justify the value. If we can bring the cost curve down, the number of use cases continues to explode. So I tend to be pretty bullish on it, but I do think we are getting these architectural changes, right? I mean, look at the big innovation in NVIDIA's latest generation of Blackwell, right? It's the move to rack scale computing, which that's a nice term we use around AI. I think historically we would have called that system level design, right? We've moved from making a chip and outsourcing everything downstream of that to really starting to build this, into a system level thinking exercise around all the componentry that needs to come together to make this scale. And I think Jensen has kind of told us this, right? I mean, he's basically said we're improving generation to generation to the degree to which we're going to obsolete our prior generation when we introduce a new generation, right? Which certainly causes problems for somebody like CoreWeave, to call back to our earlier topic, is they're, spreading that depreciation over 6 years. And I think, Jensen's telling you it's more like a 1-year depreciation cycle. So we'll let the accountants sort that discrepancy out. But I think it's really this move to system level design. AMD's going there with their next gen, MI series, that rack scale computing, kind of approach.
Now, let me be really clear on this. In the last 90 days on this show, I've converted. I have got religion. I not only believe in all this technology. There's absolutely no going back. We're accelerating the future. However, right, and this is a perfect form to do it, because this is an artifact of words. We are talking to each other. We're sharing semantic structures. We're building in our heads, saying them out loud, saying to each other, people at home are watching. And we're talking about artificial intelligence, which is, to be clear, the worst acronym in all of technology ever. Right? It's been used and applied to literally everything from cogs and springs to anything. And what we're specifically talking about here is semantic systems built on words and meanings. That's what we're calling AI. And it's not artificial. It is literally semantic systems. And is it intelligence? Frankly, I kind of think so. certainly more than most. So even the standard model chat GPT sort of thing is a convincingly conversational artifact. And as I've kind of find these advanced models of all the system based on the technology today, and if you can tell the difference between that and a person, good luck. And we're just starting. But we built it all in silos, and it doesn't make any sense. We put them in cages because everything we think about in sci-fi with artificial intelligence means that we had to build it in a cage in case it goes nuts. And that's ironic because we build something out of words and feelings and put it in a cage, it acts weird. Right? We need to socialize them and connect them and make them agentic and whatnot. And we're doing that now. And when you do, you find out, no, you don't need to stand up, Einstein to screw in a screw, but sometimes you do. We are building AI infrastructure now based on mostly small devices, Raspberry Pis, normal computers, all talking to each other all the time, doing various things. Yes, sometimes you need a GPU and you need somebody to pop up and be really cognitive. But as as I work with these systems, and discuss it back and forth with them, we shut down as humans. We don't think really well when we're doing cubicle tasks. Neither do they. That doesn't require, 3,000 gigawatts. That's a lot of the work we do is clockwork.
Dan, here's the part I don't get. So GPUs existed long before AI existed, and then we got lucky, right? When somebody discovered that GPUs are great at parallel processing and we can do jobs for AI. But there's still a lot of overhead in those GPUs that has nothing to do with AI. And we've seen the rise of these other AI accelerators from various folks. And I would argue that NVIDIA is probably going to have to create an AI accelerator to obsolete its GPUs. And all those AI accelerators will be more efficient than the GPUs for AI workloads. And then maybe we won't need as much data center capacity, et cetera. So it's not just a software issue. I think it's a processor hardware conversation as well. Or am I crazy?
No, listen, I think it's both, Mike. I mean, if you look at kind of what we forecast at Futurum, visit our Futurum intelligence platform, take a look at our XPU forecast. Listen, this market is growing at an incredible rate. Not only is there room for a ton of GPUs, and I think we'll still see really dominance from the GPU on the training side of things, but these specialized AI accelerators from the likes of Broadcom and Marvell and the hyperscaler partners that they're working with, number of other companies out there that are innovating in this space. There's room for all of them. I think we'll continue to see more specialization, more vertical integration. But I think GPU ultimately will probably lose share of the market, but it doesn't mean they won't continue to grow at an incredible rate. But I do think some of these alternative architectures and some of these other approaches, particularly on the inference side, they're viable. They're very much viable, and potentially have better total cost of ownership. I mean, look at some of the data coming out of our Signal Labs groups on TCO around some of these solutions from an AMD and others. There's a compelling case there. I think what we've seen in the market leading up to now is this trend towards heterogeneous compute, right? Building a specific tech stack for a specific use case and a specific workload. And I think we'll continue to see more and more specialization, but general purpose GPUs probably still really the dominant force on the trading side for the time being, and for the foreseeable future.
All right, folks, we got a long way to go between now and then, but I would just close this segment out by noting, never bet against innovation, because you'll lose. We'll be back in a minute.
SecurityBoulevard.com is the leading resource for news, analysis, and education on challenges facing the cybersecurity industry. SecurityBoulevard.com covers all aspects of cybersecurity, including data security, DevSecOps, cloud security, application security, network security, security threats, and more. SecurityBoulevard.com has the largest selection of security content, featuring breaking news, blog posts, podcasts, and more. Visit www.securityboulevard.com to learn more. SecurityBoulevard.com, home of Security Bloggers Network.
Hey, folks, we're going to shift a little bit of gear here, but at least the one thing we will continue to be talking about is money. But we're talking about it in the context of cybersecurity. The U.S. Treasury is now sanctioning I think it's called Aza Group, and they have something called a bulletproof hosting service that they provide for folks who engage in ransomware and info stealers and drugs and all kinds of stuff. And Chris, I feel like the conversation around cybersecurity is finally changing, and it's not just about how many more firewalls we can put at the edge. We seem to be going after the bad guys more directly, and I'm even going to relate this back to a conversation I had recently with Cisco, where people are now manually tracking where the network traffic comes from and are cutting off access to the pipeline for some of these folks. And is the whole play around cybersecurity just getting better and smarter finally?
First thing I'm gonna do is give a shout out to Pete Herzog, who's out there doing the good work. And sometimes you got to shut things down. And you can check out LinkedIn and see a post from him just the other day about this. And his short answer is yes, right? That's focusing mostly on cybersecurity for my entire career. I'm now that I'm old, I'm appreciating the fact I've been saying all along. It's like we don't suck as much as we think. We didn't do that bad in '99. We weren't that awful in 2007. We're not doing that bad now. We've been building up structure for a long time now. And right here in the middle of the decade, I'll say what I said in 2020 to friends, mostly just to stir them up, but also because I mean it. This is the last decade of cybersecurity. I mean, we're not going to go on forever suddenly saying, oh, threat intelligence, we tried. Oh, has anyone, no threat? Oh, supply chain. Oh my God, we never thought of supply chain. There is a finite number of major blocks of cybersecurity. They were all outlined by the early pioneers, before, anybody on this screen, including myself, got involved. And we're slowly working our way through them. And everything else we're talking about on shows like this shows the path. We are working on a POC right now that will get a software bill of material at 400 milliseconds to a aerospace rocket flight engineer from request to return across 3 steps in supply chain. Because the systems were all there, the components that, including the semantic systems we spent all our time talking about, to do that in the real world in real time. So things like, I like the Lone Ranger. I like going after bad folks, shutting them down. I'm a big fan of that. But the big problem with cybersecurity, and more importantly, narrative integrity these days, is how hard it is to be a bad guy. Cybersecurity has been weak enough, despite the fact that we've built the internet and kept it running, that anybody who really wants to can just be a malicious actor all day long and make money at it. And on the global scale, on top of that is the narrative layer, which is being hacked for profit, and control. So, but we're closing in on it. We're getting better. These signs are good signs. Just if you looked up the Pete Herzog article by now, you notice that some official organizations aren't really, public and private, always following up on that, because we haven't always been there. But I believe we're getting there. It shouldn't be so easy to hide in the dark and do bad things in cybersecurity, especially not anymore.
Kate, is there optimism in the world here, or is it, to Chris's point, still too damn easy for the bad guys to be bad?
It's still very easy for the bad guys to be bad. I think that we still don't have a great strategy in order to tackle this, meaning that we've seen these threats over and over again. We've seen the bad guys, the bad threat actors get together and have, $3,000 for this malware, 24/7 support. We've seen this, right? We've seen this forever. Are we making a step in the right direction? Yes, we are. Do we need to do it together collectively? We do. We really, and that's something where I see hope, is that we're actually doing this together.
Right. And let me just be clear, because I don't think what we just, I don't think shutting these people down does any good whatsoever. Right. I think it's a good thing to do. I think we're getting to the point where we won't have to do it all the time. But it's like, look, the war on drugs, the U.S. war on drugs, to be clear, all the money spent and all the drugs interdicted did do, stop bad guys and criminals, but it didn't stop any American from getting and using all the drugs they want. Shutting down these cyber criminal organizations is good. They're bad folks, but someone will fill their spot until, to your point, okay, we have strategy and we coordinate it, or we have the tools in place where it's just not so bloody easy. That's where I think, my optimism optimism is. I think we've been moving for a long time. I think, again, everything we unfortunately call AI is going to be opportunities, today and in the next couple of years, to really make it hard to be a bad guy. So we're not having to try to just put them in jail and so they can get replaced by the next one.
Dan, to Chris's point, and we've been just overly obsessed about tech and cybersecurity and not really considered the fundamental economics to change the equation. And I don't know, are there things that we could do collectively as policy? Because I know you follow policy in Washington, so I always feel like there's somewhere a disconnect in all these agencies running around, but nobody seems to actually say, what are we collectively doing together?
Yeah. Listen, I think the macro trend we're seeing in the cyberspace is that, the value is really shifting from, going after these individual bad actors to going after really kind of criminal enterprises and state-sponsored bad actors, right? The challenging part is that, this is market forces at work. Like, unfortunately, creating cybercrime is good business. People are making money doing it. And, I think as you've gone away from more of the individual bad actor into more, organized criminal syndicates, you're opening up a lot more tools in terms of how we address this. It's not just a technology issue. Now you've got, legal routes, you've got banking routes, you've got all of these different things you can be doing to kind of really circle in on the people who are doing this at scale and the people who are really doing it at a level of disruption that goes far beyond any sort of individual bad actor, bad actor, kind of the basement dwelling, identity stealer, that's not really who we're focused in on so much anymore. I think it's getting harder for those folks, but still relatively easy. I think that the tone is really shifting to the organized crime side, the state bad actor side, and really, leveraging tools beyond technology that go down much more of the kind of finance and legal, routes in terms of how we address kind of the core issue here.
Integrating geopolitical intelligence becomes part of the strategy. And that really needs to be seriously looked at. We're not, regardless of how we try to be isolations, we're not. Especially with cybersecurity, right? We all have to play together and actually share intelligence, which is the antithesis of how we think, right? I feel we have not been great from a company standpoint, from vertical standpoints, where the attacks have now become cross-vertical, vertical industries, and yet we still hesitate to share. And I think it's important to gather this intelligence and geopolitical intelligence in order to fight the latest threat.
Yeah, I mean, back to your point on policy, Mike. I think we're so focused on kind of the bad actor side here. A lot of what we can do is, sometimes the best cyber defense is an educated user, right? Like, what are we doing from a policy perspective to really teach digital fluencies, early on in schools and academia, right? I mean, that's a valuable life skill for people to, kind of graduate out of their education with, is some level of digital fluency, best practices, kind of being a smart consumer here, can prevent a lot as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna mirror Elon Musk here, just to show that politics isn't everything. Patents and all this. Yeah, I try to understand everybody's position, but to be clear, for my entire career, I've helped people figure out their security. While personally, I secure very, very little in my life. Now, what I do secure is secure. I've actually taken care of it. I'm not trying to feel good about it. And the rest of it, I honestly believe that transparency is better, faster, cheaper, safer, more resilient. Share everything you possibly can, so you only have to worry about those last little bits. And you'll find that not only do you save a lot of money on security and a lot of time in your business, your operation, your life, whatever it is, get more done, but there's all sorts of advantages. And Kate, you said that, if you don't share this sort of intelligence, if you think it's that important that nobody knows you know this about that, then you're all alone. And our threat actors are not. So how is that going to work out? So share it all, whatever you need.
To your point, we're also spending a lot of money securing data that's no longer valuable, but just because we store it and we kind of keep it forever. But Chris, I look at this sometimes, and having grown up in New York, every time there's a downturn in the economy, there's more people working for the mob. Is that how that works out here in the land of cybersecurity? And when we see a global downturn, that there'll be just more people watching ransomware kits because they're easily available? And is there a correlation between the global economy and cyber attacks, or is that too simple a metric?
Well, that could be an opportunity. I was hoping to riff on what you said, Dan, right? Because I'll be clear, if you're a young Russian citizen living at home and you're any good with computers, get into hacking. The FSB will give you tools. They'll help you make money. And anytime you break into something that they want, they'll give you a Dasha or something, right? That's just a better career plan than anything else, the Russian economy has to offer you right now. That's the reality of it. So yes, when we create these opportunities for there to be these economic benefits and someone else has the budget, yeah, they will pay you, to be a nefarious hacker. That's just the way it is. And until we have systemic solutions to that, it's a nutrient gradient. Things will grow there.
Also, Kate, if I look elsewhere in the world, in certain countries, it's now considered patriotic to go hack in other country systems, and that's part of their culture as well. And some of them are even funding their economy doing this stuff. So, uh, do we really understand the motivations of the bad guys?
I think at the end of the day, the probably primary motive, even though, I think it's still money. I think it's just good old money. How am I going to survive? And while it's not that we don't have, nation state sponsored attacks, but at the end of the day, I mean, we're wrecking, you're making somebody's day really bad financially, or, or even from a financial motive on the other side. I'm going to do really well today because I've done some ransomware. So at the end of the day, I think it's more financially motivated than anything. Even though, yeah.
Dan, I think you live in Boston, right? And I'm in New York. And last time I checked, there were still mob families running things. It's just maybe not as much out of control as it was 2 decades ago. And so my question is, will cybersecurity, cybercrime always be with us? It's just a matter of how much, we can tolerate to what level.
Well, I think, throughout the history and society, crime has always been prevalent, right? Cyber is just a new venue for it, right? We've created a digital world in addition to our physical world. And crime has found its way there too. So I continue to come back and, Kate just in on this. It's about the money. This is economics. This is market forces at work, right? This is no longer something we can only solve with technology. We need a belt and suspenders approach. Technology plays a critical role. But it's economic, it's policy driven. It's got to be addressed at all levels if we really want to make a dent here.
All right, folks. Hey, you heard it here. Even today in New York, if you were still walking down the street with your wallet in the back pocket, bad things are going to happen. So be smart out there. Hey, guys, I want to thank you all for being on the show and kind of sharing your thoughts and insights. As usual, they were awesome. And I want to thank you all for watching the latest episode of the TechStrong Gang. And please stay tuned for the lineup right behind us because there's a lot of great, awesome content on TechStrong TV. We'll see you next time.